Support for Faith on Trial and Iowa Catholic Radio provided in part by Imogene Ingredients.
Our freedom of conscience and religion is being challenged by laws and regulations imposed by secular society. It's time to hear from the top Christian litigators in the nation who have come forward to tell us the truth and help us defend our faith.
Hear ye, hear ye. All rise. Faith on Trial with Defender of the Faith, Deacon Mike Manno, is in session.
All right, welcome once again to Faith on Trial. We examine the influence of law and society on people of faith. I'm Deacon Mike Manno, your host, and I'm here with Gina Noll, our lovely co-host. How are you, Gina?
I'm doing well this morning, Deacon Mike.
Very good. We got a big day today. We've got a lot of number of cases yet to be announced by the Supreme Court. A couple of them may have a big effect on the election. We've got the debate tonight.
We're recording on Thursday.
We're recording on Thursday. And in addition to the debate tonight, that's also going to run against Caitlin Clark's basketball game, which I like to watch. Yeah, so that's on Channel 5, I think, tonight.
I would highly recommend the basketball.
Yeah, I think so too. It'll
just hit
be
the highlights.
less stressful. Less stressful. Yes. All right, we have an interesting program today. We have Andrea Picciotti-Bayer, who is director of the Conscience Project. We've had her on before. She wears a number of different hats, but she's a legal analyst, and she kind of knows what's going on. And this is the week we've set aside, or the U.S. Conference of Bishops has set aside for Religious Liberty Week. We want to emphasize religious liberty, which, of course, is the primary thing that we emphasize all year round in this program. But
That's
she's
right.
going to be there, and then we're going to step back a couple of months and bring in an interview that we have from Lance Linzer, who is with the First Amendment Partnership, and he's going to be talking about some of the things that they do to make sure religious liberty and religious freedom is available in all the states. One of the things that we will find in that interview, if you've listened to it when it originally aired, is that a lot of the federal legislation doesn't apply to the states. And so as a consequence, a lot of this stuff has to be done state by state. So we're going to talk to him and listen to him. And he's going to talk about some things that were going on in the Iowa legislature that I'm happy to say were all
came to fruition,
passed by the legislature and signed into law by the governor. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
So we will talk about those things. And then with Andrea, we're going to talk about Religious Liberty Week here and what it means and answer or ask whatever questions we have of her. She's very good at this. And
I'm imagining that she will highlight many of the tests of religious freedom that we've had on the show, that we've highlighted on the show in the courts.
Right. And one of the things that the Dobbs decision did is it eliminate the old lemon test, and which narrows the focus of what the courts can look at and how the courts analyze things. It gives them a broader focus for more religious liberty, and it allows that to happen. So one of these days maybe we'll get somebody on to explain the lemon test. And
so the Supreme Court still has some rulings to pass down before they take their summer break. Is that right?
Right.
Are there any religious liberty, religious freedom issues still being
not that
decided?
I'm aware of. I think the two that people are waiting for, and they may be deciding it now. I mean, it may be being released right now. Otherwise, they'll be back tomorrow doing the same thing. Has to do with presidential immunity, which, of course, is one of the big things
we're waiting
for Trump
that,
right now. Right, and then the other thing has to do with the January 6th defendants. And it had about how they are charged and how they were charged and whether the charges were correct. And that will have another bearing on what happens.
Big effect.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. All right. Well, it'll be good to have a summary from Andrea today.
It will be. It will be. And maybe she'll be able to update us a little bit more on what is being reported right now, since we're taping here. We're not listening to the radio.
Correct.
All right, you have a prayer to open us up with?
I do. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Prayer for peace today. God of peace, bring your peace to our violent world. Peace in the hearts of all men and women, and peace among the nations of this earth. Turn to your way of love those whose hearts and minds are consumed with hatred. Strengthen us all in hope, and give us the wisdom and the courage to work tirelessly for a world where true peace and love reign among the nations and in the hearts of all. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Gina. And we're going to take a break right now. And when we come back, we're going to be talking with Andrea Picciotti-Bayer, who is the director of the Conscience Project. And that's one of the first things we're going to ask her, all about that Conscience Project.
What is that Conscience Project?
That's it. We'll be right back. You're listening to Faith on Trial on the Our Catholic Radio Network. And we're back. You're still listening to Faith on Trial on the Our Catholic Radio Network. And we have with us today Andrea Picciotti-Bayer, who is director of the Conscience Project and is a great civil libertarian as far as religious liberty is concerned. Andrea, welcome to the program again. We've had you a couple of times before, and we've always tried to treat you nicely, and I don't imagine this is going to be any different.
No, you've always treated me beautifully, and thank you so much for having me on again. It's great to join you guys.
Oh, very good, very good. Thank you. And it's nice to have guests like you on, because what we do here, the bishops set aside a week to consider religious liberty issues. Every week we're here talking about religious liberties and things that affect people of faith, and that's very important to us. All right, let's talk about the Conscience Project. If you can give us a kind of a thumbnail description of what that is and what you do there as director.
No, and thank you so much for that. The Conscience Project's about 4 years old now, and it's really a clearinghouse for ideas related to the importance of religious freedom here at home and abroad. And so what we're really focused on, our mission is focused on basically public education around the issue of religious freedom. It's a core and fundamental American civil right. It's a core human right, as the Church explains in its Declaration on Religious Freedom. But it's one of those rights that people don't think about until it's taken away. And so the idea for the Conscience Project is to engage and to provide more public education around religious freedom, especially around specific instances, whether they're in the courts or in the public square, so that people, especially people of faith, have a clear understanding of what's at stake and can defend it within their realm.
Now, do you have a website that people can go to if they want to find out more about the Conscience Project?
Yeah, no, perfect. Thanks for asking that. It's conscience-project.org, and you'll find a lot of our writings as well as a recent video series that allows kind of for a 3-minute snapshot of different aspects of religious freedom that are compromised or under threat. We're also hoping to put up soon a shorter documentary series later this summer that's going to really engage people in the stories behind some of our greatest religious freedom conflicts today. And you can also, if people are on Twitter or X, as it's called, you can follow the Conscience Project there, as well as you can follow me personally at Bayer Picciotti.
Very good. Just a quick question before we get into the specifics of what we want to talk about today. As we're talking about people losing religious liberty, how do you find the general public is accepting that? In other words, are people kind of just turning their head and saying, oh, okay, there's an abridgment over here, I don't care about that?
You know, it's interesting. I think that there's a big challenge, right? And obviously some of the challenge is because religious freedom is being pitted against other newer civil rights, and especially in the United States, issues related to LGBT interests are oftentimes pitted together against religious freedom. What's interesting about that, pretended conflict is oftentimes there's a way that everyone can get along, and you can allow for people to have accommodations or exemptions so that people of faith aren't being forced to either do something or say something that conflicts with their beliefs. But the other issue that I think, Deacon, is a big issue is people are becoming less and less religious. Religious freedom seems less and less important. And that's really a shame. It's a shame because it puts people of faith kind of as second-class citizens, but it's also a very dangerous step because faith-based organizations and people of faith are an important part of our society's social safety net. So we think about Catholic healthcare institutions or soup kitchens, outreach for the homeless, attention for people at the border. All of those are oftentimes those kinds of corporal works of mercy are done by people of faith. And if you ask people to operate inconsistent with their faith, the great danger is that they just will stop and they'll close up shop. And that would be really harmful to the common good in general.
Yeah, years ago, before I got involved with this ministry here, radio ministry, I remember hearing about the conflicts. And one thing on television that bothered me and that really got me interested in this was an argument they were having on one of these talking head shows about whether or not a doctor could interject his beliefs in his treatment plan. And one of the attorneys on there said something to the effect that the doctor has the right to his own religious opinions, but not in his office. If he has an office, he's got to accommodate people according to the law and not necessarily according to his religious beliefs. And that stuck with me, and for a long time I wondered how that could be, why a person couldn't act out his religion in his profession. And, of course, that's one of the big conflicts right now. But that's what started me in this whole thing.
No, you're right. I mean, the talking head is wrong, absolutely wrong. In particular, medical conscience rights are specifically protected under the law. And so we can see it particularly playing out in the context of life. And even the Supreme Court recently has reaffirmed the importance of medical conscience rights to allow for healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, to let their pro-life positions be known so that they're not having to participate in abortion. Is kind of the very clear example of the law's protection of medical conscience rights. It's also coming to bear in the area of transgender health, where healthcare workers are able to say, because of my beliefs, religious as well as moral and medical beliefs, I don't want to participate in anything that's going to take away a healthy organ in order to pursue what's being dubbed as gender quote unquote, gender affirming healthcare. But in general, there's a bigger issue, and you touched upon it, and that is the right to live consistent with your faith in your workplace. And the USCCB's Religious Freedom Week is touching upon both of those issues, both specifically medical conscience rights, both for individual doctors as well as healthcare institutions, and the general right to be able to operate and work consistent with your beliefs. No one should have to go to work and be forced by the government to act inconsistent with their beliefs. We're seeing a very big challenge with the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, coming up with basically a speech code for covered employers, demanding that employers and employees use preferred pronouns, for example, and not allowing for religious exemptions from that. There's an easy way not to offend people, but also at the same time not to have to say something that's inconsistent with your understanding of the nature of the human person as God created us, male and female. And these are conflicts that are unfortunately haven't been resolved through the general administrative process, so that we're likely to see them come before the courts, where courts will likely have to reaffirm the Constitution's protection against compelled speech or against interference with the free exercise of speech and free exercise of religion, in the workplace.
Yeah, the problem, of course, is that when somebody goes after somebody for a speech code violation or something, the defendant there is left kind of in limbo until the matter is heard by the courts, especially if it goes up to the Supreme Court. And so that's something that we have to take recognition of, that these sometimes are long procedures before the courts make a final decision. And they sometimes don't make the right final decision, too.
No, you're absolutely right. And a perfect example is the story of the baker from Colorado, Jack Phillips, who didn't want to make a wedding cake, individually designed wedding cake for a same-sex wedding because of his Christian beliefs on traditional marriage. And he referred the same-sex couple to bakers in Colorado that were more than happy to do so. But he was embroiled in decades-long litigation and continues to face lawsuits now based on his opposition to baking a cake for a quote-unquote gender reveal for someone who's now considering themselves a gender that's inconsistent with their
who was an
biological
attorney,
sex.
by the way.
Yeah, I know. These are very much cooked up litigations. You know, in many respects, we can think about this as a longtime civil rights lawyer. I think we can look at civil rights icons that have stood up to injustices, especially related to racial injustice. It wasn't easy to be the first African-American students to go into a newly integrated school system. They did so. They faced a lot of pressure, and now we look to them as the heroes for fair treatment in our educational system and in society. Fortunately, people like Jack Phillips are very intensely people of faith, and they know that standing up for faith, not only for themselves, but for the faith that they point to, is something that God is asking for them. It requires those of us who aren't in the middle of litigation to pray for them, and if we have the means, to be able to support their defense. But it also requires us, and again, to go back to the USCCB's Religious Freedom Week, we need to think about when we stand up to these offenses against religious freedom, we need to do so without creating more divisiveness or division in society. And we need to do so with the importance of civility. The USCCB has come up with a pledge to ask people to engage in these debates with civility. And I think that the Christian witness is always done so with an abundance of love and civility. And that's something that is challenging these days, but it's one that I think we're made for.
The challenge is we're being asked to fight by Marxist and Queensberry rules, and the other side seems to be thinking this is an alley fight. And
yeah, it's tough. I mean, but there is something to be said of, you know, being wise as serpents and gentle as doves.
Yeah.
You know, there's a great religious freedom lawyer, Luke Goodrich. He is a senior attorney at Beckett Law. That's the religious freedom group that's represented the Little Sisters of the Poor and other successful advocates before the Supreme Court.
They have a good record.
He wrote a
yes.
great... Yeah, no, they're incredible. And Luke wrote a book a number of years ago, and he said that when we're defending religious freedom, we need to let go of winning as people of faith. We need to know that God's in charge, and the issue isn't to destroy the opponent, it's to defend the truth. And in that defense, oftentimes there are people whose hearts and minds will be changed because of how we defend the truth. We've seen that in the pro-life context, and it's also a great witness in the religious freedom context where people serenely defending their right to live, act according to their beliefs without tapping into anger, without resorting to violence, because that really does undermine our argument, even when the other side seems to be willing to engage in that kind of violent behavior.
Andrea, how did the United States Council of Catholic Bishops decide that this week is the week to celebrate religious freedom? Is it, and I'm assuming it's just in the United States, and how many years have they been doing this sort of thing?
Wow, Gene, that's a really good question. I know that they've chosen this week for several years, and I'm not sure why they chose it. I think that it's tagged, and maybe this is the explanation. It's tagged at the feast days of St. Thomas More and John Fisher, which we know were incredible defenders of the Catholic tradition in England. So I think that's why it's tagged as being connected to this week. It's not beyond our borders. But it has been going on for quite a while, and I think it's a great way to celebrate these two icons of statesmanship as well as fidelity to the Catholic Church and Catholic tradition. The U.S. has Religious Freedom Day that's celebrated. They also have International Religious Freedom Day as well that are recognized for the perspective of kind of our government. But that isn't this week. This week is a chance really where Catholics in the U.S. are called to, as the USCCB says, pray, reflect, and act. And, it's one of those great reminders that the Church engages at the natural level, but it also has a supernatural calling. We're out of step, often on purpose, because it gives us all a chance to focus on higher things, such as, praying for an end to blasphemy laws and apostasy laws that are really active outside of this country, as well as things that we're experiencing ourselves where people are being silenced, either with specific laws or just social pressure to be silenced, not to speak up for the truth, to be worried about, kind of the sensibilities of your neighbor as opposed to their actual good.
You talk about the persecutions outside of our country, but many of those types of persecutions we're seeing invoked here in the United States. I think of the one over the weekend with the synagogue in Los Angeles, with the attacks on the people of faith there, and our government's response or lack of response to it. And the number of churches, the Catholic churches over the past 2, 3, 4 years that have been violently trespassed and accosted and destroyed items, and part of the church is caught on fire. So some of those atrocities are infiltrating their way into the United States, and I think that's really important for the United States, the bishops in all of our parishes, to be on alert and to really speak the message of truth in the way that we are allowed to express our faith in the United States.
Gina, I couldn't agree more with you. I think it's really unprecedented, the attacks, the anti-Semitic attacks that are happening across the country, especially after the brutal events of October 7th in the Holy Land. And I'm very heartened that the Christian response, the Catholic response, has been one of community and unity with the Jewish community here. But to see that kind of violence in Los Angeles, and also violence several months ago on college campuses. There was intimidation against Jewish students. None of that is acceptable. None of that is American behavior. And all of it deserves a very strong response from local and from the federal government. But to your second point about the attacks on places of worship, both on synagogues and our Catholic churches, in the last 4 years, there have been over 400 documented attacks on Catholic churches here in the U.S., more than half of that in the last 2 years, corresponding to the release of the leak of the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs overruling Roe versus Wade. The Catholic Church, as well as pro-life pregnancy centers, were targeted for vandalism, for violence. All of this is lamentable. All of this is a very big threat to the right to worship and a clear violation of what's called the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances and Churches Act, which has been lopsidedly prosecuted by the Biden administration when it comes to abortion clinics, but not when it comes to the safe an easy entrance to our churches. And so we really need to continue, like you said, to stand up to these acts of vandalism and violence, but also to demand the prosecution of the perpetrators.
Do you see the, I guess when we look at the general public, you see there's a lot of apathy out there about what is going on. Do you see that changing?
I'm an utter optimist.
You have to be if you take this side of the road, yeah.
Well, and that's one of the reasons why the Conscience Project exists, is to energize people. Energize not only people of faith to stand up for religious freedom, but people who aren't particularly tied to any faith tradition. There is a benefit to a vibrant and robust political and public square that includes religious interests and the defense of religious belief. If that's silenced, we really will lose a lot about what it is to be an American. And I think that we're seeing more and more people realize that the push for what's called ideological conformity, where people have to all think one way, isn't really American, and it's not good for us. And as people of faith, we have even more of an interest in promoting what we know to be true. So I think that it's oftentimes people tell me, people just don't care about religious freedom, and I think we have to. Well, and, I'm glad you guys are doing it. I'm glad you guys have welcomed me on and are doing it even outside of our conversation.
And oftentimes people don't understand it until it walks into their own church or into their own community, and then their eyes are wide open. Unfortunately.
Yeah, I think you're right. And, there are often times where there are subtle chipping away at religious freedom until you realize that it's also been gone. It's the analogy of the frog in the boiling water. We need to stand up for our beliefs, and part of it is we just need to exercise them. We need to go to Mass. We need to talk about the role of God in our lives. We need to talk with, our co-religionists as well as people of other faith traditions about how this makes our lives better and how we're able to do more for the good of others because of the beliefs that we hold true.
And we have to consider our civic responsibilities, too. It's one thing to be a pro-religious freedom and to speak about it, but if you're going to sit at home on Election Day, you're letting it all slip by.
No, I couldn't agree more. We need to be engaged as citizens, as full citizens, and also we need to make sure that we're always respecting the rule of law. Obviously, if there's an unjust rule, we need to work to change it. But, for example, Catholics are really doing wonderful work to alleviate suffering at the border. It can never be done in a way that disrespects our immigration laws, for example. So we have to navigate and walk that line very finely, where we're caring for the refugee, for the migrant, but never working at odds with the legitimate laws that are passed related to the flow of people in and out of our border.
We are pretty much getting to the close of our time here, so why don't you give your website address again for people that want more information and how they can contact you and how maybe they can help out with the Conscience Project.
Yeah, no, great. Our website is conscience-project.org. And as I mentioned before, you can find on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, Conscience Project as well, where we're posting either reactions to things that are happening or our own original commentary pieces. And as far as what people can do, first off, I think we've gotten a great example from the USCCB. We need to pray. We need to pray more for people who are facing these conflicts here and abroad. We need to reflect and think, what is it that I can do in my own community, in my parish, in my diocese to encourage people to stand up for religious freedom? And if we have the ability to act, we need to support people that are going through these conflicts, whether they're here or abroad, Aid to the Church in Need is doing incredible work in defense of Catholics in hotspots of persecution, but also religious freedom groups here in the U.S., Alliance Defending Freedom and the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty are doing so oftentimes in the courts, and they need our help, both financial as well as prayer.
A couple of our reoccurring guests are from Beckett and ADF.
No, they're incredible.
Yes,
They've done such great work, and I'm glad they're coming on.
And there are a dozen others out there that show up regularly, too, and we talk about these things. We are out of time now. I want to thank you for coming, Andrea Picciotti-Bayer, who is Director of the Conscience Project. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll look forward to having you again.
Thanks so much.
All right. God bless you. Bye-bye. We'll be right back after these messages. You're listening to Faith on Trial on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network. All right, and you're back. You're still listening to Faith on Trial on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network. We're going to play right now a taped interview we had some time ago with Lance Linzer, who is director of the, I guess it's the First Amendment Project partnership, and talking about some of these religious issues that come up before legislative bodies, especially in the state level. One of the things he's going to talk about is the Religious Reformation Act, Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was recently passed by the Iowa legislature and signed into law by the governor. That was pending at the time of this interview. So we'll be back at the end of this interview to recap things. We have with us now Lance Kinzer from the First Amendment Partnership organization. Lance, this is your first time here, so we'll be good with you. So you come back. That's how we get guests back. We have to be nice the first time. All right, why don't you tell us a little bit, since we haven't had anybody from the First Amendment Partnership on before, what it is and what it is you do.
Sure. So First Amendment Partnership is a national organization focused primarily, at least in the lane that I'm involved in, on state-level religious liberty advocacy in legislatures. So there are a lot of great groups out there, Beckett, ADF, First Liberty, and a number of others who do really excellent work in the litigation space. And so we don't litigate cases. We do work in concert with many of those groups on a number of issues, but we really focus on trying to promote pro-religious freedom legislation at the state level. And my background personally was as a state legislator in Kansas, where I live from 2004 to 2014. And actually worked with First Amendment Partnership as a legislator before I then began working for them full-time as an employee in 2015. So that's really our focus. We've been involved in a number of legislative efforts in Iowa over the years, some successful, and we are engaged with a few bills in the legislature this session as well.
Good. How many legislatures do you visit in the course of a legislative session?
Yeah, it really varies from year to year. We're a small organization, so at some point you bump up against some bandwidth issues. But generally speaking, we have bills at least introduced in a dozen or so states across the country each year, and that's pretty close to what we're doing this legislative session in terms of the number of bills that we're working on. So as state legislatures were kicking off in January over the first month of the session, I think I was in 7 state capitals in 4 weeks. So we're involved in quite a few places.
Well, you're moving around. How did you personally get involved in this?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to tell that story. So, I was pretty involved in pro-life work as a legislator. That was really my focus, that and a few other issues as chair of the House Judiciary Committee in Kansas. I did that for 6 years. But towards the tail end of my legislative service, in my last couple of terms, we had a number of religious liberty issues begin to pop up. And the one that really caught my attention and led me to introduce a bill that the Iowa legislature is trying to get across the finish line this year, was a case involving an issue, yes, but really it was involving a person, a woman named Mary Steinmetz. And Mary Kansan from kind of north central Kansas, she was a Medicaid recipient and a Jehovah's Witness, and Mary needed a liver transplant. And because of her views on blood transfusions, which was a point of view that she had that I didn't really understand very well, and certainly not one that I share, but it was so important to her that she was seeking to go outside of Kansas, because at that time there weren't any Medicaid recipient hospitals in Kansas that could perform her transplant surgery consistent with her sincerely held religious beliefs. So she wanted to go up to Nebraska, in Omaha. That seems like a simple thing. It wasn't going to cost the state of Kansas any more money than it would have for a surgery in Kansas. But because of state Medicaid rules, if you were going to go more than 50 miles outside the state lines to get medical treatment, you had to get a waiver from a bureaucratic board, a Medicaid waiver board appointed by then Governor Sebelius in Kansas. And that board would not give Mary Steinmetz a religious accommodation to go get that treatment. That led to a process of both administrative hearings and then litigation in which the underlying issue was what standard does the state have to use when their actions are burdening someone's sincerely held religious belief in order to be able to continue in that course of action. So the state of Kansas was arguing that they just had to show a rational basis for their decision. Others, her attorneys, were arguing that the appropriate standard in a case like that is strict scrutiny, a standard where, in essence, the state has to show there's a compelling state interest for burdening her religious belief and that they're using the least restrictive means necessary to advance that interest. We had confusion over what the legal standard was in Kansas, and there's a deep background to that as to why there's confusion in states as to what their legal standards are. We can get into that, but the bottom line is that Mary Steinmetz, in the process of attempting to vindicate her right to a religious accommodation, a life and death religious accommodation for her condition so deteriorated during that time frame that she was ultimately no longer eligible for the transplant list. And so literally in the United States of America, in Kansas, in 2012, Mary Steinmetz died for her sincerely held religious belief around blood transfusions because a bureaucratic board wouldn't grant her a religious accommodation. That's a dramatic story. It's not the context. It's more dramatic than the context in which most religious liberty disputes with the state arise, but it shows just how serious some of these issues can be. And so in 2013, in Kansas, the legislature passed, and Governor Brownback at the time signed a bill, a version of a Religious Freedom Restoration Act, that made it absolutely clear that as a matter of state law, when government action or inaction burdens someone's religious beliefs, the government has to show we have a really good reason for doing this, and we're using the lightest touch that we have to in order to advance that interest. If that standard would have been clearly in place in Kansas, I think Mary Steinmetz would have gotten her liver transplant timely, and she would have gone on to live a longer life, certainly, than she did. So that's a long answer to a quick question, but that literally is the issue that got me involved in religious liberty work, that first connected me to First Amendment Partnership as they came alongside and helped us with that legislation. And I think Iowa listeners would be interested in knowing that Iowa has that same ambiguity currently in their law that Kansas had for so many years. 25 states have passed statutes to clarify that compelling state interest strict scrutiny standard applies. Iowa has not yet done that, but there are bills both in the Iowa Senate File 2095, and in the Iowa House File 2454, that have gone through the subcommittee process, that have passed out of full committee, and that are ready for floor action at such time as leadership decides to take it up in both chambers. And so we've been working on that issue with a number of Iowa legislators and advocacy groups on the ground there in Iowa for a number of years, and are really hopeful and optimistic that this will be the year that Iowa becomes the 26th state to clarify this important religious liberty issue in their own law and make sure that strict scrutiny applies in these areas of conflict between government action and religious liberty. And I'll just say, to kind of close off this answer, and can answer certainly any questions you have about RFRA and that issue, but I think that in the aftermath of the COVID experience, a lot of legislatures around the country began relooking their law in this area because they began to see that state action and local government action can oftentimes be used to impact religion in a way that's unfair. We had cases around the country of, casinos and liquor stores open and churches closed and those types of things. And so since kind of post-COVID, there have been 4 states, both of the Dakotas, Montana, and West Virginia, that have passed RFRA standards, I think in part because there was a real heightened sensitivity to the need for this clear legal standard in the aftermath of some of what occurred during kind of the COVID pandemic. So, again, apologize for the length of that answer, but that's how I got started.
It's a very good answer because, sometimes we look at the big picture and we see these flashy cases out there where school children are taken someplace or required to do something, or, as you point out, strip clubs are open but churches are closed. But we don't often look at what you're talking about here, which is getting down into the weeds, the nitty-gritty of the law and how it's supposed to function. And some of these things that you're working on are monumental questions. They just don't attract all the interest that some of these other cases would. So it's important that we think in terms of little things like this, which, changing the standard of review. Yep. It means something.
It really does. And I would say, in terms of just broadly protecting religious liberty across the board, it's probably the most important thing that any state can do. It was clear under the Constitution for quite a significant period of time that just under the First Amendment, this was the standard that applied. And then in 1990, there was a U.S. Supreme Court case that cast a lot of confusion on that. The federal government relatively quickly, and interestingly enough, in a very bipartisan way, with Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch, the Democrat and Republican in the Senate, introducing the federal RFRA, and interestingly enough, then member of the U.S. House of Representatives, Chuck Schumer, was the sponsor on the House side of the federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and that's now been in place at the federal level for 40 years, based upon some subsequent litigation. That federal statute does not apply to the states, except it applies to land use issues, and it also applies if you're incarcerated. But absent that, the federal law in this area, the federal standard, doesn't apply to what they call facially neutral, generally applicable state or local laws. And with that creates this interesting gap where in a state like Iowa that doesn't have clarity on their statute, if you're arrested and put in the county jail, you have a more vigorous set of religious liberty protections that apply to you than if you're just an average citizen in Iowa. So it's a real anomaly. A lot of states have seen this and have taken action to correct it. There are a whole host of other things that are really important to do with respect to religious liberty that involve kind of how the law is drafted, say, to protect conscience rights, for example, or things like this in particular areas. But in terms of just making sure that everybody who has a sincerely held religious belief is treated fairly in the courts if they have to litigate to vindicate those rights, RFRA is really critical, and so I'm excited that Iowa is so close. I think right on the precipice of getting that passed. But the final thing I'll say on that, in terms of why it's so important, is that what we found in Kansas since we passed it, now we're at 10 plus years that we've had it on the books, is not that it generates a ton of new litigation in these areas, but rather it's really helpful in terms of the litigation that it helps to avoid. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're a local unit of government and you're contemplating taking some action that you know may cause friction with some, local religious institution. If your city councilor is telling you, if this comes up and they complain, we just have to show we had a rational basis for doing this. It's no big deal. We don't really need to worry about these people. Let's just go ahead and do it. That's one thing. If, on the other hand, the councilor is saying, our state law makes it pretty clear that if they complain about this, we're going to have to go into court. We're going to have to meet a very high standard. In that second scenario, it's much more likely that government officials are going to say, before this controversy arises, let's sit down with the group that may be affected, see if there's a way that we can achieve what we're trying to achieve here that is, that's acceptable to them. And you get a lot of issues that maybe would have been subject of litigation or controversy that get worked out really in the way that they should get worked out, especially at the local level, because the government knows they're going to be held to a high standard of proof. So I would just say anecdotally, as good as it is to have the RFRA standard when you need it to litigate, the really good news story about RFRA is the way in which it kind of shifts the negotiating balance of power so that local units of government and state are more likely to just take into consideration the impact of their actions on religious individuals and institutions before they do something that creates conflict or controversy.
How is RFRA doing these days? I understand that there's an effort to repeal it on a federal level. There have been bills introduced to either repeal or limit RFRA. Not typically the bills that have been introduced at the federal level are more about limiting the areas of law to which RFRA applies. But that legislation has never really gotten significant legs. And so I think it's interesting to note that even though there are sometimes you see discussion about the possibility of repealing RFRA or limiting RFRA at the federal level, not only have they not repealed it, they've never even passed a law has never passed that even said, hey, in this particular case, the RFRA standard doesn't apply. So an interesting one, people had different points of view on it, but the Respect for Marriage Act that passed about a year ago, there were it passed with unanimous Democrat support and some Republicans supported it. It had both what might be viewed as, expanded LGBTQ protections with some religious liberty elements in it. But in that instance, that's the kind of bill you might have thought that especially Democrats who've been critical of RFRA in other contexts would have said, hey, with respect to these LGBT protections, we don't want RFRA to apply. But that provision was not in the bill, and every single Democratic member of both the House and the Senate voted for that bill with the RFRA overlay still in place. So I don't want to say that there's no concern that RFRA might be limited. It depends upon the makeup of a particular Congress at a given time and who the president is. But so far, that hasn't occurred. It hasn't even been, limited. And in some ways, what happened in the context of that Respect for Marriage vote at the federal level was, a bit maybe encouraging. So I'm hopeful that RFRA will continue to operate at the federal level. I also think the other thing that's going on is that we have a Supreme Court that I think is clearly relooking that case from the early 90s that created a lot of this confusion in the first place. If you recall, a couple of years back, there was a case, the Fulton case out of Pennsylvania. It involved Catholic Charities in Philadelphia protections for a faith-based adoption agency. And in that case, a unanimous Supreme Court upheld the right of the adoption agency in that case to make placement decisions consistent with their sincerely held religious beliefs while still operating as a contractor in Philadelphia for
foster and adoption services. That's an issue, actually, that we work on at the state level as well. There are 10 states that have passed their own state-level protections for faith-based adoption foster care agencies. That's a separate issue. But in that case, there were 5 justices that expressed at least an interest in revisiting that Employment Division v. Smith standard. And so that's encouraging, and it'll be interesting to see how subsequent litigation works out in that regard. But in the meantime, until that's clarified, it is really important for states to create clarity in this issue. I think it reduces the amount of conflict over issues of religious liberty, and it establishes a fair standard for everybody.
What do you see, and we've got to do this quick because we're going to be running out of time here in a second.
Sure.
But what do you see as kind of the pressing issues in states these days concerning religious liberties?
Yeah, there's a bunch, but because we're pressed for time, I'll just mention 2. One, protection of healthcare rights of conscience. And in Iowa, there's a bill right now, Senate File 2286, that's passed out of committee that would offer a much more vigorous level of conscience protection for medical professionals. Iowa right now already provides pretty good protections for medical professionals who don't want to participate in abortion. But there are a host of other, ethically concerning medical procedures that have become increasingly commonplace in recent years that many medical professionals do not want to be engaged in. And the law, especially the state law in most states, is much less clear on what their rights are in some of these other contexts than they are with respect to abortion. So that's an issue that's getting a lot of play and a lot of attention across the country, and one that Iowa is taking up this session. And then I would say a broad panoply of parental rights-related kinds of issues. Iowa last year passed some legislation that we had some involvement in, providing better parental notice and opt-out rights around sexual orientation and gender identity instruction, banning what they call confidential social transitioning, where schools are using one set of pronouns with the kids at school and then switching and you're not telling the parents about that. Those issues are really are issues that a lot of states are taking up. And then this emerging issue, we're engaged with it in a number of states in kind of the foster care and adoption context, where states are saying that prospective foster parents won't be licensed to foster at all if they decline to sign off on kind of the state's view on various issues around marriage and family and sexuality. Not just saying you might not be the best placement for a gender dysphoric 14-year-old, but saying you can't even foster an infant unless you in advance will agree to kind of a whole set of presuppositions regarding LGBT issues. And that's happening right now in a number of states. It's being litigated, but there are numerous states where we're engaged that are looking to, as a matter of state law, to the maximum extent they can, make sure that doesn't happen in their state. There's a whole bunch of other stuff we could talk about, but
we'll have you back.
I'll wrap it up there.
We'll have you back. In case people want to find out more about First Amendment partnership, how do they do that? How do they go about that?
Yeah, so, we've got a website, a Twitter account. You can certainly just Google First Amendment Partnership and it'll come up. FirstAmendmentPartnership.org is, generally speaking, the easiest way to find us. And, we're happy to work with some great partners in Iowa, just kind of bringing some legal expertise to bear on issues that are being worked on in the legislature there. And it was great to have a chance to chat about some of that.
Very good. And we thank you for your time, and we will have you back. It sounds like you've got a lot more to tell us if we just had the time.
All right.
We'll do that later. Lance Kinzer, who is Director of Policy and Government Relations at the First Amendment Partnership Institute. Thank you very much. And Gina and I will be right back after these messages. You are listening to Faith on Trial on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network. And we're back. You're still listening to Faith on Trial on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network. Interesting program again today, even though it was kind of a two-parter here with part live and I guess live on tape, and then one from a couple of months ago.
Well, and I don't think very many Catholics know about this week, this Freedom Week that the bishops have pronounced. So Religious Freedom Week by the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops. One of the things that occurred to me after we left Andrea is a good way to know about, like we feel like most of this stuff is happening to us for the first time, but I would argue that many, many saints throughout history have succumbed to these pressures of a secular world. And knowing the saints, studying the saints would be a good way for us to understand what's happening and why and what we can do about it.
How to live in a society like ours that has kind of abandoned God and abandoned the concept of religion is important, because that's where we're living right now. That's what we have to deal with. And we have to stand out, I guess, as lights in the darkness.
Right.
And then we have to follow through with action. Right. We have to do what we're supposed to do.
We need to reverse the trend.
That's right.
And it's our job as Christians and Catholics and even our Jewish families need to work towards that goal.
All right. I think we are totally out of time now, so let's end with our Defender's Prayer.
That's great.
And then we wish everybody a happy 4th of July. Yeah.
That's right.
St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray, and do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, thrust into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. That's it for this week. Next week, because it's the 4th of July, we're not going to be with you live. We're going to give you a best of program to listen to, but we'll be back in 2 weeks with another edition of Faith on Trial. In the meantime, make sure you go to church and take your kids.
Our freedom of conscience and religion is being challenged by laws and regulations imposed by secular society. Faith on Trial, with Defender of the Faith, Deacon Mike Manno. Faith on Trial on Iowa Catholic Radio, iowacatholicradio.com, and the Iowa Catholic Radio app.
Support for Faith on Trial and Iowa Catholic Radio provided in part by Imogene Ingredients.